Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our 31 days of gangster films and police films from the year 1970 to the present. And as I've mentioned before, let me now say again that it is my hope that this can provide us, you and me, with the opportunity to be able to talk about as many films as possible in the context of these really wildly inventive and electrifying and entertaining genres of cinema, those being the gangster film genre and the police film genre. Today I'd like to focus on a film that I think can be said to be part of the gangster film genre because among its ensemble cast of characters, we do have very critical and significant characters that can be said to be belonging to or having associations with the gangster criminal underworld element. Now, I mentioned the word ensemble because we can also describe this film, or it has been described as, it's been described in many ways. It's been described as being an ensemble, it's been described as being a crime saga, it's been described as being one of the great works of American cinema, of cinema writ large, independent cinema from the 1990s, etc., and from one of the most worldwide famous and regarded filmmakers of this generation. And so now I'd like to speak about it in the context of the gangster film. This is a film that is described as being from 1994. And it has a very now iconic cast. And so we have people like Uma Thurman and Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta and others. And this is a work which is described, as I say, from '94, written by Roger Avary and Quentin Tarantino. And it's directed by Quentin Tarantino. And the name of the work is Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction is a work that is, it's really very famous. And it's considered to be a type of milestone or landmark achievement of cinema from the 1990s. I mean, it has ripple effects in terms of its influence, wide-ranging influence, the way in which it landed on the cinema scene in the early 1990s, and its grip, it just took off and it never let go. And to this very day, it's one of those films. I mean, it's a film that I think for a number of people, it marks their own cinema journeys in terms of a shared generational experience. I mean, it was that big. It is that big a film. And that includes my generation. I mean, I remember growing up in the 90s when this film rumblings began to occur, and one began to hear of this film, Pulp Fiction. This is the huge event film, and the attention that it got once it was released, it was really through the roof. It was electrifying in terms of what was being generated and all the critical acclaim that it was receiving. And the dialogue and the reactions to the various plots and the way in which that was organized and the almost the audacious nature of a lot of the scenes. They are very bold, inventive, quite confrontational, and also very challenging as well, I would say, to the viewer in terms of what we were seeing before our very eyes. And what we were seeing was it felt on the one hand to be quite like an adrenaline rush, almost to the point of being very glorified on the one hand. At the same time, there were senses and rumblings of almost a subversive nature to the way in which things were being told here. So there was already being set forth here a type of monumental film experience that was promising, a type of complex, rich, and very, I think, potentially ever-changing type of viewing experience. And I dare say that a film like Pulp Fiction, in many ways, I think, could be said to be living up to that promise fulfillment. It is an incredible work. It is an incredible work that continues to excite, to ignite conversations. It certainly has been interpreted and reinterpreted and questioned and debated and criticized, as well as being lauded and celebrated for its audacity and its spirit, and also its incredible collection of various elements of cinema, the rendering of character, dialogue situations, the way that stories are told, the way in which time is used, the way that we have various borrowings and homages made to literature of the past, cinema of the past, and that cinema could be American hard-boiled crime, detective fiction type of cinema. The same is true for literature, and it can go beyond to other forms of cinema from other parts of the world. For example, the French Nouvelle Vague as being one, as well as other places. And so, and then we have too the voice of this filmmaker, Quentin Tarantino. And as we know, Quentin Tarantino's filmography, in terms of his directorial work, didn't start with Pulp Fiction necessarily, but this was certainly a film that gave that it, for a lot of people, put his name on the map, as it were, and it's been a very how should I put it? It's been a really quite incredible landscape of cinema whenever you have Quentin Tarantino involved, and that is true for many examples, such as this example of cinema, Pulp Fiction. Now, we can talk about the plot, or just very basic elements of the plot, where we have various dealings of characters, some of which are maybe belonging to a certain gangster element. Maybe they are low to mid-level criminals in organized crime fashion. Maybe they're dealing with the orders of the boss or other type of influential crime figure in this area of Los Angeles, or these areas of Los Angeles. And through these various machinations of movement and character, we get to know a little bit about who these characters are through side stories and stops along the way, little tangents or diversions that end up being their own organic thing, whether living in the form of the actual side stories that are presented to us in cinematic fashion before our very eyes, or whether they live in the form of the sparkling and incredibly memorable, and now so it's so iconic passages of dialogue that are expressed and spoken by the characters here. And this is one of the great things about this film, Pulp Fiction. It's a film that seems to be many things at once, many stories at once, oftentimes to do with gangsters and criminals, and also the people that are affected by those criminal activities, and how they turn and turn and turn, and things build and build and build. So there's so many stories going on at once, and because of that myriad of detail and possibility, things can change in an instant. You can go from one story to one story to one story, or even within a story structure itself, a subplot, you can actually have sudden turns and sharp left turns going into completely unknown directions and situation. Now, that is one of the strengths of a film like Pulp Fiction, which is the fact that it can still hold surprises because it goes into so many different and new and unknown territories that in turn lead to the characters having to adapt given the change of circumstances. And that leads also to a really compelling story about characters that we watch that might be maybe having our sympathies one moment, that then we are repulsed or horrified by what they're doing the next moment. Characters that, in other words, we might see them as being sympathetic on the one hand, but then suddenly later we might see them as being quite villainous. And then maybe the opposite might occur. Maybe a character that might seem villainous might turn, and our sympathies might grow depending on how these circumstances change, again, in an instant, on a dime, with the deft handling of the storytelling that is at play here. So this is really quite wonderful. And then that type of handling of story is a lot to do too with the balancing of stories. There are many stories going on. This can be said to be almost like an omnibus portmanteau almost type of situation, although we do have wonderful overlaps of character. And this is part of the fun too, seeing how these various stories link and what the linkages are within the context of the film and maybe even beyond too. Outside the corners of the frame, which is also part of the fun of watching this or other works by Tarantino, and that also leads to the very inventive use of time and time shifts. And one of the very famous things about this film, it was one of the things that was so critically lauded at the time of its release, especially, was how the film was treating time and chronology. It's a very exciting nature to this film. And then that goes to the great use, the feeling, the atmosphere, the sunshine, and also the twilight of the nighttime scenes add to the real effect of this film, as well as the music. One of the things that was so iconic at the time too was the soundtrack release, and I remember I got the soundtrack release as well, and I listened to it, and I was so riveted. Again, I was quite young, many years ago, but when I got that CD soundtrack, it was, wow, this is incredible. So that was another, I think for a lot of people, that was a type of defining moment in terms of one's own cinema journey, to see how the musical choices interacted with the work itself in a way that solidified and not just grounded this work, but solidified it and really made it its own phenomenal thing. It became a phenom. And that's partly to do, or that has in large part to do with the musical choices here. And they're great musical choices. And then we have the great performances. These characters are now in many respects, one could say that they are in the history books as being among the most iconic characters of like late 20th century American cinema landscape. And so therefore we have the performances by Uma Thurman and Bruce Willis, and then also by Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta, and then we have other great characters that appear, performed by Tim Roth or Ving Rhames, Amanda Plummer, etc. So, and then some really memorable, what might be called maybe cameo roles or brief appearance roles, but nonetheless, oh, so memorable in terms of what they are bringing to the table and what they are doing and saying as well. And sometimes it's quite funny and hilarious. Sometimes it's quite shocking and confrontational. Sometimes it's very much in your face. Other times, metaphor upon metaphor upon metaphor is applied with such pizzazz and style. So there's a lot going on. It is a full meal of a film experience, Pulp Fiction is. And and it's been seen so many times, it's been watched, it's been assessed, interpreted, scrutinized, and it still remains to this day a phenomenal achievement that, as I say, brings about, engenders discussion and debate and questions, while at the same time reminding us of the prowess and the electrifying nature of the cinematic craft that is on display here from Quentin Tarantino and company. So this is, in many ways, to conclude this discussion here, let me say that again, when it was released, it was in the 90s, so I was still a teenager, and I just remember the buzz. The buzz around this film was, upon its release, was through the roof. And one particular detail just caught me so much, which was there's the great show, the review critic show, which was Siskel and Ebert. This was the show on TV with Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, the two very famous film critics. And they had the show where they would sit and in the studio that looked like like the balcony of a movie theater, and they would be discussing the films of that week, and they would be either agreeing or disagreeing and talking about the merits, recommending or not recommending, and the reasons why in these short televised film reviews. Now, when Pulp Fiction came along, they were both so enthusiastic about it, I remember. And I remember too that their discussion, and I haven't seen it in a long time, but my memory, when I first saw it on TV, their Siskel and Ebert discussion about Pulp Fiction, they were so enthusiastic. And they were talking about one of the strengths from their point of view was the dialogue of the film. And one word that was discussed in that review as an example of how wonderful they thought the dialogue was they were talking about how this film uses the word correctamundo. And they were saying, oh gosh, the fact that the film uses the word correctamundo, wow, this is amazing. I just remember how they were emphasizing the brilliance of the use of the phrase correctamundo. And so ever since then, whenever the word correctamundo happens to come up in conversation that I might be involved in or participating in, whatever the case may be, it could be completely non-related to cinema, whatever. But if ever the word correctamundo comes up, I always think of Pulp Fiction, and I always think of Siskel and Ebert, and it reminds me of how enthusiastic they were and remained as they continued on from that initial release point. So yes, that is an example, I think, of how strongly this film just caught on at the very start, and it never let go. This is the work from Quentin Tarantino, and this is Pulp Fiction. Okay, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.